Welcome to Secrets for an Inspirational Life with Mimi Novic, the place where every heart tells its story. Whether it's inspiration, courage or hope you need, you've come to the right place. Sit back and enjoy the journey with us. Subscribe below to be sure you don't miss future episodes.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Secrets for an Inspirational Life. How are you today? I hope that you are well. I hope that life is blessing you with some beautiful moments, and especially now that we are reaching some difficult times in the world, I have to say, we mustn't forget that there is still hope. We must be brave and we must follow the dictates of our heart. Because no matter what is going on out there, if we can find that center point within ourselves, if we have the courage to follow all that our soul is leading us to, we will find amongst the darkness the light. And not only for ourselves, but if we are following our true calling, the thing that stirs excitement and passion in our lives, we can then lead people to find their own world. And with that, find their own sanctuary of peace. Now, I am absolutely delighted today to welcome my guest, who is all the way from the United States, and that is the very knowledgeable Jim Savage. Jim is a drug and alcohol counsellor who's been working as an expert in his field for over 30 years. Jim himself is a recovering addict and has been sober since 1988. In addition to his clinical background, Jim is also a professional musician and producer. He is dedicated to using music and the creative arts to carry a positive message about recovery. From rock musicals to musical meditation programs, he uses creative material as teaching tools and aids. After running his own adolescent treatment program for 10 years, he wrote a book called Rehab Works, a parent's guide to drug treatment. He has gone on to develop an entire educational program for families and individuals. Today, he shares his journey. Welcome, dear Jim.
Hi there, Mimi. Thank you so much for having me. This is really an honor, and I'm excited.
I'm excited, and thank you, Jim. It's an honor for me. And I know you are all the way in the United States.
All the way. It's all relative, I guess. But yes, all the way over here in the United States. Yep.
Yeah. And where is it? What part of the States are you
I'm
based
in Connecticut. I'm in Connecticut.
Okay. I've never actually been to that part of the States, but from what I hear, it's very, very lovely.
Oh, I just moved here from Texas 2 years ago, and I had never really paid attention to Connecticut or knew what Connecticut really was. And our daughter married a guy from here a few years back, and all of a sudden, on a whim, we were up here visiting, and we sort of looked at it, and I had no idea it was such a gorgeous state and so much fun stuff to do. And so my life is just really full, having made this move to the beautiful state of Connecticut.
Yeah, it's incredible. The people that you meet in life, you never really quite know where they're going to take you and how much of an influence they're going to have on your life and how much they can change your life, in fact, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's just totally incredible.
Now, you do so many different things, and I'm going to let you tell us a little bit about what you do and how this journey of yours as being an expert, as I said earlier, in your field began.
Well, okay, as an expert in my field,
Mm.
I did I did some a webinar presentation. I had some slides once, and when I was developing the background piece on me, I I said I've been in the addiction treatment field for 30 for I think I said I've been around the addiction. I've been in the addiction. I can't remember how I said it. I've been in the addiction treatment. I've worked as a professional in the addiction treatment field for over 35 years, but I've been around the addiction treatment field for a lot longer than that. And then I put up a picture of me at 17 with a champagne bottle raised to my mouth. And I said I was doing field research when I was young. And so, point being, I uh, I I first got put in drug treatment when I was still in high school, and that began my journey of learning about addiction on the patient side of it. My story is that that didn't take at 17, but by the time I was 22, I'd found out that what they were teaching in there was for real, and I had hit a bottom, and I put myself in treatment when I was 22. And at that point, I got sober, sort of, there being the operative word there, but I decided to go back to school and become a drug counselor. And I just made the mistake that a lot of people that fall into is I got sober and I went to school to become a counselor, and I sort of used that as my recovery program. Didn't think that I needed to do that recovery stuff like we were teaching the clients. And I started working in the treatment field, and I eventually relapsed into my addiction again. Only this time as a relapsed drug counselor, I ended up back in rehab. Um, and that was uh, obviously a real significant experience in my life. That was 1988. And I got to tell you, when I was listening to your opening, there was, two things that resonated so strongly with me in what you said there. You mentioned just the innocuous little finding light out of the darkness, or you said something about light and coming out of the darkness. And I would characterize that whole experience of me relapsing, ending up in drug treatment again, relapsed drug counselor. They did an intervention on me and sent me to a treatment center where I had sent a client 2 weeks earlier, a 19-year-old kid who I had said, you need to go to rehab. And I ended up sitting next to him as a patient. And that was very humbling. And there was even more to that. But that whole experience of becoming what we call an impaired professional, and having to start over again on my recovery and then reassess, where I fit working in the addiction treatment field. But I'm a fan of the phrase "dark night of the soul," and that was my dark night of the soul. And eventually, the other thing that you said in your opening was about helping people find their passion. Um, and that's what I would characterize, the last now 35 years of my professional career in helping others find their passion, because that's what I have done. And again, recognizing that dark night of the soul is an integral part of this transformational process. We have to go into the dark to examine, and that's what opens the door for that, however we want to phrase that, spiritual experience, the light coming out of the darkness, renewal, rebirth, psychological development, however. And so the last, like I say, 35 years of my career, I've gotten to the point where I'm able to use all the things that I love doing, namely, one, passion for helping other people achieve recovery, and then combining my other interests using music and spiritual development and things like that. I've been able to put it all together in some creative ways to help others. How's that?
That's fantastic. As you were talking, Jim, I was thinking of all sorts of things to ask you, but that touches on so many points. And the the first thing I wanted to ask you was, at what age did you begin to drink?
I was really early out of the gates. You know, it was, sometimes they talk about whether people are born addicts, and sometimes in recovery circles, you'll hear people say, I was an addict before I ever took my first drink or whatever. And I don't know what I really think about that, but I would say that, boy, I hung around some older kids that used, and they were hippies, and I was enamored with them. And I can remember in sixth grade, and that's one, I got my musical interest from them, and I heard them talking about drugs. And I can remember on the playground in sixth grade telling the other kids, lying about the fact that I was doing some drugs with these people. I sort of wanted to do that. And so I started using when I was in about eighth grade. Ninth grade is when I got, I actually started off doing the stuff that you could find around the house. I was sniffing glue and inhalants and stuff like that, and then graduated to alcohol and pot when I was in ninth grade. And I was, from the get-go, one of those that wanted to try everything as fast as I could, as much as I could. First kid on my block to do everything, including getting put in rehab by the time I was 17.
And ninth grade, for people out there, how old is that?
Oh, I don't, 14, I'm guessing, something like that.
14. Now, addiction, a complicated subject at the best of times, called a spiritual disease by many. And listening to you and what you have gone through and what you have achieved, in fact, you are really the perfect person to help people out of this darkness, because I think unless you have experienced the dark night of the soul, the darkness of one's own being, I think it's pretty impossible to go out there, dig in deep, and rescue people in a way out of that darkness, because you have to know how to maneuver the darkness.
Yeah, in the addiction treatment field, there's always been sort of the ongoing debate about, should you be a recovering person to work in this field? You shouldn't. Should absolutely not have to be an addict to be able to be an effective addiction professional. And there are lots and lots of really good addiction professionals, better than me, who are not in recovery. I will say that it's a pretty common thing to hear clients say that, well, what really works with you is I can relate to you. And so there's obviously a really significant component of trying to help someone through this particular malady, having been through it yourself. You understand, and you can create a rapport. Now, as I'm saying that, I'm thinking about the fact, something that I happen to my experience. I'm pretty an advocate about the professional recovering person. It's really important to be aware and establish and have really clear, healthy boundaries that my professional work is not my recovery. Because as I told you in my little synopsis of my background, my experience as an impaired professional, I fell into the trap that a lot of people do. I'm going to get sober and I'm going to help other people and forget about the recovery. And I fell into that trap of thinking, well, this is my recovery. I'm talking more about recovery all day long, every day with the clients than those guys that are going to their meetings 1 hour a day or a week or something like that. And so again, I'm a really strong, advocate for being clear about the fact that my work with addiction clients is not my personal recovery. And I sort of go overboard on saying that to drive that point clear. Now that being said, it's a fine line between being able to effectively use my experience in recovery, and I am as open as they get in terms of sharing how I work my program with clients. But again, I have in the back of my head instilled in me, this is not the same as working with someone, a peer who I'm just helping, get sober, or working with the people who are helping me get sober still at this stage of my recovery. Big difference there. But to your point, obviously being able to relate on this one goes a really long way in establishing rapport and creating trust, and also knowing the ins and outs of when someone is taking shortcuts and being able to talk about where the shortcuts lead, because I've lived that myself also.
Now, how would you put yourself in a position, would you say, to say that you are a recovering addict, or what are the words that you would use? Because some people say, I've been sober for this amount of time. Some people say, I'm going to be frank. People say you're only one drink or one, line away from falling back into that addiction. It's such, as I said, a complex issue. At what point are you at?
I call myself a recovering addict. And again, you're correct in terms of that's sort of a hot topic, a lot of interpretation. And even in the recovery circles, people get into arguments about whether in whether the AA big book talks about we're recovered or recovering. And my personal, opinion on that is, why are we wasting our time talking about that, about recovered or recovering?
Mm.
I happen to understand the medical aspects of diagnosing what we call a substance use disorder. And actually, when you mentioned my work with Rehab Works and in the education stuff that I've done, that's all focused on explaining what addiction is. And there is no diagnosis for addiction, for the term addiction. That's a characterization. There is a medically identified condition called substance use disorder. And the truth is, there's characteristics of addiction that once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. I say, well, there's something to be said for that. But if we're honest, if someone says to me, okay, and I'm going to recommend that you remain abstinent for the time being, at least at this point. And I can explain, I won't take the time now, explain why abstinence is a good thing as far as what our brain recovering. And the brain does recover over time. And if somebody asked me, how long do I need to remain abstinent, Jim? If I'm being responsible, I believe, and a responsible professional, the right answer is, I don't know. Because there isn't, as far as I know, a litmus test for, okay, the brain, addiction, in a nutshell, really oversimplified, the brain rewires itself so that we lose control. I call it the party voices get louder than the not a good idea voices. And we experience loss of control. And the brain does heal itself, but it's a slow process. And we get better over time, but I don't know that there's a litmus test, or you can't put it in the electron microscope to see that those neural circuitry has rewired itself back so that I can return to normal controlled use. And there's only one way to find out, the way that I look at it, and that's to try it. But I also know some of these other characteristics of addiction. If it's like playing Russian roulette, if I lose, there's words like progressive. We pick up where we left off even after, and there's countless stories of people who stayed sober for 20 years plus and resumed drinking, and they were dead within drank themselves to death, in a short time. And at the same time, I'll also say there's plenty of people who stayed sober for periods of time and then perhaps did return to use, and they seem to be able to control it and be just fine. That's your complex part. To me, it's sort of like you have to zoom out. The easiest way is, it's like, it when you see it, the real deal. I happen to, after going through treatment 3 times over the course of 11 years, from 17 to 28, and it keep doing the same thing even after long periods of sobriety. I personally believe that I'm one of those people now, after 36 years. Just last week was 36 years. I'm not taking a drink or a drug today, even if I outgrew it 20 years ago and I'm wasting my time doing all this recovery stuff. I'm not taking the chance of finding out, because if I bet wrong, I know what can happen for me. And so that's why I consider myself continuing to recover.
They say there are functioning alcoholics and non-functioning alcoholics, because I know people that are able to hold down a family, a career, and still be alcoholics. And this has always made me curious. And then there are people who simply can't. The drink becomes their idol, and that is the most important thing in their life. There are many theories about it, but my interest is, what is your opinion on this? Why is it that some people are functioning, can function normally, so to speak, and some absolutely can't, and walk the streets drunk, or give so much abuse to their families? What happens? What's the difference here?
Well, one of the things that you have to, in beginning to work with a substance use client, the first thing is we have to education. We have to understand. It's one of the most misunderstood topics about what it means, quote unquote, to have a problem. And again, I go back to that. The problem is really, if we think that somebody has a problem, we're arguing about whether it's a problem or not. What we're really talking about, I believe, is if they meet diagnosable criteria for having what we call a substance use disorder. And again, very complex. One of the things is that first things we have to teach is that there's all sorts of different categories of patterns of use. One of the first things they did back in the early alcoholism treatment education stuff is they identified, like alpha, beta, delta, gamma patterns. There's binge drinkers, again, and then even chemicals, categories. Some people are alcohol is their drug of choice and they don't do anything else. Some people prefer stimulant kinds of drugs and they don't like the downer kinds of things. There's some people that are opposite. I was what you call the garbage can variety. I liked anything and everything. And so first you got the categories and or the substances that you're using, drugs of choice, and then you got the patterns. Some people go on 3-day binges, just total blowouts, once a month or once a quarter, and they don't do anything in between. Some people are, loaded all the time. Some people are, drink 3 drinks a day or 4 drinks a day, and it never changes. They never get smashed. They're never out there partying. So that's the first thing, is there's these different patterns. I think what you're sort of getting at, when we talk about the functional, I give an example of sometimes, this is again when I'm teaching about diagnosing, daily use of a substance. In old school diagnostic terms, daily use was a symptom of addiction. And I have to point out that one symptom does not mean you have a problem. A symptom is just a red flag of aberrant behavior. But evidently, people who use something daily, that's going to be a characteristic red flag. We need to look at that. But I immediately will say there's lots of people who use alcohol on a daily basis, and they aren't anywhere close to having anything that you would consider a problem. And so you say the person who has a glass of wine or 2 glasses of wine every night with his meal, okay, their daily use of alcohol, not alcoholic, that what goes into it is their reason for using it, and 2, what happens as a result of it. And so I always give the example, you could have the high-powered CEO, Fortune 500 company. I'm feeling myself being politically incorrect if I'm calling this a male right now, but I'm going to say he, and he never goes out in parties. He never has, 3 martini lunches during the week. He just comes home every night, has a glass of wine, but he's alcoholic. And if you have to do an assessment and dig into what's going on, because he could say, I have a glass of wine every night with my meal, and that's the only alcohol I drink. And if, say, you talk to his wife, and he says, and she says, oh, he told you about his glass of wine, his 1 glass of wine. Oh, he never quite, that 1 glass doesn't have a bottom to it. You get my point there. And his 1 glass, what he tells himself is 1 glass is really 3, 4, 5 glasses. And he's doing it to catch the buzz. And that's why are we doing it? To change how we feel, the intoxicating effect. And then, and then if we find out further from the, family members, in this case, say she goes, well, I haven't slept in the same bedroom with him for 20 years because I got tired of him coming in his wine haze, sort of half conscious after having his 1 glass of wine with his dinner, and crawling into bed and grabbing me, and I got sick of that, and so I moved into the other bedroom. And you could say, well, what kind of a relationship is that? That's not satisfying your needs, and that's not a healthy relationship, right? Why do you tolerate that? Well, I like the lifestyle he provides me, and she stays with it. And that's very subtle consequences related to the substance use. And it's easy to overlook. That's actually pretty big. If you believe in marriage and a commitment and quality of relationships, but again, it's very subtle, but you could say that's maybe the worst consequence you could have, a knife in the back of the relationship type thing. And it breeds unhealthy behavior, and she's into that codependent response. She's compromising her values as a result of it, but he doesn't lose his job ever. So do you get where I'm going with that?
Yes.
It can be subtle, but you got to get in there and look under the covers to see, okay, job functioning is one thing. How about emotional functioning? Dynamics, interpersonal dynamics stuff. And sometimes it can be very subtle.
And that's 2 things I wanted to ask you from there, Jim. And one of the things, I don't drink. I've never drank at all. And I'm curious always you talk about the buzz. What is that pushes somebody to reach that, I suppose, level? I can only put that as an understanding on my own part. What pushes someone to try to get that buzz, and what is achieved in that buzz? Because so many people are now rushing for that buzz and are walking around mostly like zombies.
Well, that's that we can go into. You're asking what is it that we're looking for through that intoxicating effect, basically?
Yes.
That
Yeah.
sort of. Yeah, and okay, to put it simply, you hear me, I've used the term already, changing how we feel. I happen to believe that, early on, I read a book by Andrew Weil called The Natural Mind. And he says that man has an innate tendency to alter consciousness. We start it early when we're 5 years old. We spin around in circles. We discover spinning in circles makes me dizzy. And that's this weird experience where all of a sudden I fall over. And if you notice, when some little kids playing around, they get dizzy and they fall over, and that's sort of weird. What happened? Why did I fall over uncontrollably? Do they laugh or smile when they have that? I mean, do they laugh or frown when they have that experience? They laugh. It's sort of funny, right? And I think that's that's an altered state of consciousness. And Andrew Weil saying it's natural for us to want to and experience an altered state of consciousness. And then we continue to learn ways of changing how we feel. And then we hit that age. For some, drugs and alcohol work very well for changing how we feel. And it's natural. We see other people around us doing it, and it's natural to do that. And some people, stay on that level. Weil's point in that book is that it's a progression of altered consciousness that keeps going up a ladder. The drugs and alcohol is not the top of the ladder, but each level above, he's going to say, like, meditation and ceremonial spiritual practices are going to be another step above that. And his point is that the more respect and the purer the way that it's achieved, the greater the effect. So like with meditation practice, you can experience altered states of consciousness in meditation or ceremonial experiences, but it takes a lot more discipline and respect for the experience. It's easier to drink a six-pack or smoke a joint than it is to master the art of transcendental meditation. And so some people stop at that drug and alcohol level thing, and then that's where, again, the complexity gets into everybody's brain is different, but what happens is everybody has a different, every individual number, like the mattress number. Everybody's got their own individual number as far as the propensity for their neural circuitry in their brain to rewire. Some people drink and nothing ever changes, and they never start drinking more. They don't stop drinking. It's not a big deal to them. Some people might go through periods of what looks like heavy use, but they never seem to cross over that threshold into that full-blown once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. And they quote unquote grow out of it, and everything in between. Like I say, I had the propensity for my brain rewired really fast, and I liked that changing how I feel. But then unfortunately, the brain rewires, and then you're into this. It's like being a diabetic. If you cross over into the diabetes category as opposed to being pre-diabetic, then you've got to treat the condition, and it's different than recognizing, oh, pre-diabetes, I need to make some changes to prevent a worse condition from developing. But, again, what I've based my career on then is I happen to believe that desire, the question is, why does man, as Weil said, want to alter consciousness? What's that about? And I happen to believe, and I won't go the long answer now, but we can maybe go in this direction here, of that I believe that there's a direct relationship between addiction and our desire for spiritual connection. I think that the using the drugs is for that intoxicating effect, is for many, many, many people on some deep level a desire for connection. That's becoming a popular. A lot of people are starting to recognize, okay, the solution to addiction is connection. I take it a step further, and a lot of the work that I've developed, I explain exactly what that spiritual connection is. But again, I happen to believe that's what we're trying to achieve. And I can give you a great example. When I ran my treatment program, and I was known as the creative, sort of out there, non-traditional spiritual guy. And I was the guy that had the treatment center, that had the drums and the candles, and we burned the sage and we meditated and all that kind of stuff. But my whole basis of how I've worked my career, my treatment approach, is to tap into that desire for the spiritual connection and help them experience it without the chemicals. And so, to give you an example, I used to always do this. I'd open my groups with a drumming session, and lots of times I would lead a meditation, and you're probably familiar with this kind of work. I would drum, and I'd have them lay flat on their backs, and I'd sometimes go over them, and I'd drum over them, and I'd create sort of a shamanic kind of thing happening. And when they would come out of it, I have this image in my head. It happened hundreds of times over the years. A teenager, brand new, the cobweb's still in there as far as he's been sober for 2 days or something like that. And I give him this experience of this drumming meditation thing, and they come out of it and they'll go, wow, that was like being high. And then, and instead of yelling at, oh, we're not talking about being high, let's not glorify drug use, I just say, yeah, tell us a little bit more. That was like being high. And I guarantee you, I'm not making this up, they would always say it was like being high, but it was different. And they stumble around for words for a second, and they say, but it was different. It was like pure. And I'm like, yeah. And again, my whole approach for treatment is to, rather than shaming and scaring people into recovery, my thing is to give them something to light a spark that inspires them to want more of that. And so I would create these experiences that tap into that. And this newly sober kid is like, wow, that was really cool. I want more of that. And then being able to harness that and direct all that effectively along an approach that supports recovery from the substance use, but really it's about getting them lit up, about exploring spiritual, development, whatever that means to them. So that's a long answer to, I believe that the buzz has something to do with a desire for spiritual connection.
Yes, I agree with you, actually. It's something, and thank you for that explanation, because it leads me on to my next question, which is, I read a few years ago that somebody had gone into a nightclub and they'd had one of those epiphany moments when all of a sudden they saw everything as it really was. And one of the things that they were doing research on was the effect of drink and drugs on people. And one of the things that they saw was the attachments of different energies upon these people. And that's something that I know that people have spoken to me about in their experience, is that they do seem to transcend a veil, maybe not a good one, but where they become more susceptible to other types of energies that are around them that can be, mostly when they are in that state, malevolent. And this is something that all of these addictions open a doorway to, which is a completely different doorway, where you're talking about the pre-diabetic and the diabetic, which is a different doorway to the one that you are opening for them, which is the pure doorway, as that client of yours said. So my question to you is, what is your view that when someone is in this state of addiction, whether it be drugs or alcohol, do you believe that there are other types of forces that are connected to that person?
You know, I'm there's a beautiful quote I've used for years to introduce my discussion of the realm of spiritual exploration and the mystical experience and addiction or mental health issues. And so years ago, I came across a quote from Joseph Campbell. He said, "A mystic swims in the sea of the unconscious. A schizophrenic is drowning in it." And and that's I think a really great way of illustrating this concept, that I believe that mental illness, addiction, spiritual connection all exist on a plane, a continuum, right? And and sometimes I lead off, before I say that Campbell quote, I start off with a sort of the joke: what's the difference between a mystic and a schizophrenic? The mystic knows when to keep his mouth shut. And pointing out that we might be having the same experience as people who are quote unquote crazy. The mystical experience, you use the word transcend. The mystical experience is transcendent, which means, and you're right about that veil there, that's a good word also, of transcending the veil. But the very definition of transcend or transcendent means you can't put it into words. You can't explain what it is that you experience. And so recently I've been having some conversations, and I've got some hot opinions about the psychedelic craze that's sort of taking place now. And the landscape is changing dramatically quickly over the last couple of years, and I have some concerns about that. I'm doing some YouTube talks, about one. I'm saying I am really, really know that I have to be open-minded and learn more about the value of this psychedelic, for some of the reasons that they're using it. But I also say, there's a lot of stuff that I don't know. I'm not a doctor, and I don't know some of the research on the ketamine or whatever. I will say there are some things I do know a lot about, and one is I know about addiction and recovery, and I also know a lot about spiritual traditions. I've been trained pretty thoroughly in indigenous spiritual traditions. And I make the point that spiritual exploration using psychedelic stuff to open ourselves up, well, I do not discount that is a real thing. It goes back to that, what I was talking about, Andrew Weil saying, the more knowledgeable and respect that you have for the practice, that is integral to the purity of the experience. And so I use the term, I sort of jadedly say, because I worked with a lot of teenagers that fall into this category, I say, when you have suburban shaman wannabes ordering ayahuasca off the internet to trip, to get high, as someone who has some experience in the indigenous perspective of the use of what we call power plants and believing them as spirits and stuff like that, I'll just say this might sound a little crazy to some viewer. I'll say this really quickly and won't explain it. I said that to a kid once when I found out he was ordering ayahuasca off the internet, and I said, I don't want to be sitting next to you in group tonight because I don't know what's going to happen because you're playing around with stuff that you don't know what you're getting yourself into. I'm not lying when I say a half hour after our group began that night, a tornado hit our building. And I had told the other kids in the group, this guy here is being a suburban shaman wannabe. He's playing around with powers that he has no idea what he's getting himself into. And all I know is a half hour later, a tornado hit our building. But a couple of weeks ago, as I'm preparing this talk that I'm giving on my concerns about the psychedelic, used for spiritual exploration, whatever, and I came across, I was rereading The Power of Myth, the Joseph Campbell book, again, and I came across where he talked about the schizophrenic and the mystic, but he actually was saying it in a different context because they were talking about psychedelic spiritual exploration. And Campbell said the schizophrenic is drowning in this sea of or the mystic swims in the sea of the unconscious. His comment about the person using psychedelics for spiritual exploration, Campbell said, and how brilliant is this? Campbell said, the unprepared explorer drowns in it. So instead of schizophrenic drowning in it, he said, relative to using psychedelics for spiritual exploration, he says the unprepared explorer drowns in it. And then he went on to say, if you catch what it is that you're chasing, it can end up being a terrifying experience. And I thought, bingo, I loved, because I knew exactly what he was talking about, and I put it in a video the other day, and I didn't go into detail. I just said, he's not just talking about having a bad trip, I don't think, when he says if you catch what it is that you think that you want. These, a lot of people, they read about the spiritual exploration, and the acid, the ayahuasca can give me an ego disintegration. And these young guys I'd work with, they say, I want to experience that. I want to experience ego death. And I'm like, no, you don't. You have no idea what that really entails going through an experience like that, because we're not talking about a bad trip one night. It might be a long period of time in your life, as you say, an addiction period or something like that. And I think that that's what Campbell was referring to. If you really catch hold of what you are playing with by using, again, in particular, that psychedelic stuff, you're playing with, there's different levels of spiritual, again, belief systems, whatever your belief system is. But yes, I believe that it can be explained that way. You can get yourself into some bad medicine, and I happen to believe that whether you're calling it it can be explained both ways. You can explain it. I can have my own personal woo-woo kind of sounding personal beliefs about powers and things like that, like you're referring to. Or if somebody doesn't think that's a bunch of mumbo jumbo, you can explain it from a psychological perspective also. I happen to think it's all sort of the same thing.
Understood. Yes. And the story of the tornado is an interesting one. Somehow, I think out there now, people are inviting certain things into their life, as with the psychedelics, that are quite dangerous in the wrong hands. And I think it's something that seems to be extremely popular, and more so that not only are people more addicted to alcohol or drugs or whatever it is, but this whole craze now of experiencing these spiritual states, but without, as we spoke about earlier, without the discipline, without the knowledge in that respect, but something that is in a way like a get rich quick scheme. Let's get spiritual quickly.
Right.
So do you think that what is actually happening out there, that people are so disillusioned in life and so far from themselves that people are clinging on to something, to substances, for example, to these psychedelics, in order to find their true being?
Again, I think that has always been the case, and I'm not even sure. These days, when I hear people refer to these days, these times, and I think we've been saying these times, we're living in extraordinary times. Things are really bad in the world, and it seems like every generation it's a new level of the same description, right? And so I think on one hand it's not different. But on the other hand, yes, you could say, of course, there's an absolute higher degree of what's the opposite of connection, disconnectivity. People with their phones and the virtual everything, and of course, there's a gross lack of connection, in how we're interacting these days, and if you go with the approach that the solution to addiction is connection, or addiction using the substances is a misguided attempt to satisfy a connection, then absolutely, and there's two things that I'll say, because the other point that I make about the spiritual exploration, and I realize when, if I'm talking to the public about my views about the psychedelic exploration, I'm trying to be open-minded and show that I'm fair, and I acknowledge my limitations and what I don't know. But then I realized after I did a YouTube talk on it, and a friend of mine, I asked, "What'd you think about that?" I was sort of rough on, I'm pretty opinionated, and he helped me clarify. He goes, "You're protecting the addict," meaning, I'm a drug and alcohol counselor. I'm in recovery. I see everything through that lens. And I have to realize that I am totally focused on the person who's in recovery, who sees the opportunity to microdose with psilocybin. And I know, as I said, I know a little bit about addiction and recovery and that brain rewiring. I was an experience. It was good. Over 10, 12 years ago, I was at a dinner in California, addiction professionals, and there was a guy sitting next to me, and he ran an Ibogaine clinic in Mexico. And the Ibogaine is sort of the same type of thing, go through an experience like that, and they use that to treat addiction. And I'd been aware of that for a few years, and I'd been wondering, I'm going to tell you another story here in a second about this, about how I would respond if I was in the position to do psychedelics as a recovering person. And so here I am sitting next to this guy at dinner. And he's telling me about his Ibogaine clinic, and he'd love to bring me down there and have me tour, and I can experience it myself. And I'm sitting here thinking, whoa, this is my lucky day. I am getting offered, all expense paid trip down to Mexico to a nice clinic on the beach. And I could actually, do the Ibogaine treatment, and I get a chance to trip for a couple days under the heading of research, and it doesn't. I don't have to call it a relapse, and I knew within about 45 seconds of watching my brain's response to the thought of being able to do that I had my answer on how I was going to respond. I knew there's no way I can do that. And again, I'm somebody who has shamanic training, and I understand the respect for the spirits out in the jungle that provide these plants to us, etc. And I understand the concepts of the ego disintegration and where that, how we explain that on a spiritual level. I understand and have the utmost respect for all that. And I knew when this guy said, want to come to my Ibogaine clinic? And I was like, hell yeah, that's awesome. I recognized that as the addiction response in me. And I thought, you know what? It's still in there, live and kicking. And I realized I've got no business doing that. Now, maybe I can only speak for myself. I don't want to, there can be people listening to this saying, yeah, but that's you and that's not. Blah, blah, blah. Well, you know what? Again, addiction's a complex subject. Maybe some people have used heavily for a while, but they never really became full-blown addiction, and they may not respond that way. But I do know that there are a lot of people who are in recovery that is waving poison in front of their face I get these flyers all the time from, psilocybin retreats and conferences, and they look like Grateful Dead posters, and I saw a conference where the furniture on the stage was all mushroom furniture. And again, maybe for unaddicted people, oh, that's sort of cool and funny. But from my perspective, we call that glorifying drug use. And that's actually on the list of symptoms of addiction is preoccupation or glorifying the chemical use and drawing. When I was in high school, I used to draw Yes album pictures on my choir folder. And that was me glorifying that trippy psychedelic thing. And so when I see these stages with mushrooms and stuff, and I'm like, okay, what is this really? Is it, cheap thrills, or are we really making sure everybody who is going through this process has this level of respect and understanding? But again, my main concern is for the addict who's in recovery and the potential that represents for a relapse trigger, and they're back in the addiction before they know it, and what can end up happening for them as a result of that, as Campbell says, could be a terrifying experience if they catch what it is that they're looking for.
Very interesting, really, and a warning, actually, to be extremely careful with every step that you make in this world, I would say, whether you are a recovering addict or not. It's very good advice. Thinking about all these things that are out there, one has to be cautious at all times, I believe, on all levels. And what interests me is about your experiences in the shamanic field. How did you get into that?
Well, when I went to treatment, I was out in Arizona, and it was in the desert. And, every treatment center now has one of the guys, the alternative spiritual counselor. And he was the guy that came in on Sundays and did, for those that didn't want to go to church or whatever else was offered. we could do the alternative spiritual stuff. And he's the guy that brought the drums, and we did some ceremonial ritual stuff. And he would take us for walks out in the desert and look for feathers and little pieces of turquoise and crystal. And I actually clicked with that. I had no interest in spirituality prior to that. But I actually, when I walked up to the treatment center and I looked out at the desert, I literally had a moment where I heard a voice. I was looking out at the desert and I heard a voice, and it said, "You're spiritually bankrupt. And if anything's going to happen for you, it's going to happen out there." As I was looking out in the desert, and I was like, I'd never seen the desert before. And I had no idea what that meant, what I was thinking. I never thought about the fact that I was my spirituality before, but that's what came to me. And then so I go into the treatment center and I begin that dark night of the soul. Don't know it at the time that that's what's happening. All I knew was it was humiliating and painful and oh, it was rough. But I did actually click with this alternative spiritual guy, and I got lit up with it, and I got really into it. And he told me about he'd take people out in the desert for overnights and let them sit by himself and confront their fears or whatever, right? And I thought, well, that sounds cool. I want to do that. And we made plans for me to go out after I discharged from treatment. I was going to stay there a couple extra days. And he said he wasn't going to be in town to lead me. He said, but you can go by yourself. And I don't know about that. And I won't go into the details there, but I've got a story on my YouTube channel called The Owl, the Desert, and the Shadow. And that tells the details of my trip out into the desert. I went out for 3 days and I literally almost died. And I had some burning bush woo-woo experiences involving owls and Gila monsters and almost dying of exhaustion and heat stroke and all sorts of bizarre things happening. But that was the beginning. Obviously, I made it back out of the desert, but that was my death rebirth experience out there. And that began my journey of both reestablishing my recovery. I had to make sure my recovery was rock solid, and I couldn't think about working in the field for a long time. Just focused on my recovery. I started studying spiritual traditions, and I got involved with several groups and started getting into the training, and I started doing vision quests. And sort of on my first vision quest, my vision came to me. By then I was starting to work back in the field, and I was working this stuff in with the clients. I was using medicine wheel stuff, and I was relating recovery to the medicine wheel. And I was I was taking treatment clients out to watch the sun come up, a symbolic ritual way of watching the sun. Go sit by yourself and watch the sun come up, which was a precursor to the actual full vision quest, where you go off to the top of the hill by yourself for a period of prayer and meditation, and it's a letting go and a death rebirth thing. And I eventually, when on my first vision quest, I sort of translated the vision that I got as my vision is to bring the vision quest back to young people. And long story short, I can say I spent the next literal 25 years almost going on a camping trip once a month with a group of teenagers and creating a vision quest experience for them, working it into their treatment. And my whole treatment program was based on that. And creating my vision, my purpose in life is to help other people light the spark that gets them to want to continue that spiritual growth. And boy, and I learned how to walk that fine line between getting labeled a flaky new age guru guy with a sophisticated, solid, clinical person running a clinical treatment program that was not flaky. But boy, I took it to the edge and challenged my own fear of what other people would think, because I knew that it worked and it was producing results in terms of helping these young people find their own spiritual path. And that's why I use that phrase. What's the difference between a mystic and a schizophrenic? The mystic knows when to keep his mouth shut. You can imagine there's a lot of times I wouldn't talk in public presentations about some of the things that I would talk about in my treatment groups, or, because I could get into woo-woo sounding stuff. But I will also say that in shamanic practicing, there's an element called ritual drama. And that's basically, it says that, it's set and setting in psychological terms. Get the patient to believe that they can be healed, and that's half the battle, right? And so my career has also been the effective use of ritual drama. And I would know how to push it just to intrigue these young people. Wow, I want that. And I'd tell them some of my stories, and I prepare them for Vision Quest, and scary stuff can happen, and you go out there and you're not supposed to leave. You got to trust that your higher power is going to protect you and that kind of thing. Even if a bear comes, or even if it's freezing and you're going to think you're going to die, this is a spiritual thing. And they're like, yeah, I hope something cool happens. I hope so, and I suggest that's that desire for that mystical experience, and just giving them something. These are kids. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in it. That religious stuff. And then I would sort of use my alternative spiritual, approaches to put these little hooks out to get them to sort of illuminate the fact that, they actually do believe in something. They're just waiting for something to attach it to. It's in there. I'll say one more thing here. The best example I have of the ritual drama, and it ties into that psychedelic thing and all this stuff. When I would introduce myself to new groups, and I would come in and I would lay out all my ceremony. I always did groups putting a blanket out on the floor. We set up a medicine wheel, and I got candles, and I got feathers and bones and this. And because I would sometimes go into treatment centers that they didn't know me. I didn't work there. And I'd be introducing myself. Okay, here's this far out, woo-woo guy. And I start telling them my story. And I would say to them, when I started getting, training in the spiritual teachings, I would ask, because they always would make a crack. There'd be one in every group. When we'd sit down and we'd sit around the blanket, and to start group, I'd say, let's start off by everybody just go around and say, what's it feel like sitting around this blanket? And because this comes from the very first time I ever set up this blanket, and I had no idea why I was doing this, but the people started saying, it feels spiritual. And I was like, oh, if my goal is to get people to feel spiritual, maybe setting is half the battle, right? Instead of sitting on chairs and fluorescent lights, let's sit on the floor around a ritually, developed, configuration of sticks and bones and feathers, and it makes them feel spiritual. Hey, what a concept, right? And so, but there'd always be one kid in the group that would make the crowd, looks like we're going to do some peyote. And instead of yelling at them and saying, hey, we don't talk like that in here, I'd say, well, let's talk about that. And I would tell them my history of getting trained in spiritual practices. And a lot of that was with Native Americans. And I said, I asked three counselors over the course of, or three teachers that I had over the course of a couple of years, same question. What do I do as a recovering addict when they break out the peyote? And all three of those teachers, they didn't know each other. They come from different areas and stuff. They all immediately said, firm response, you don't need the plants to get there. And now picture this. I'm telling this to a group of treatment client patients, substance abuse treatment patients. And and I tell them, these guys told me, you don't need the peyote to get there. And I would say, yeah, right. You're telling me that if I beat the drum hard enough or burn enough sage, I'm going to have hallucinations like I used to when I was doing really good, blotter or window pane acid. I didn't believe that. And right now I'm doing ritual drama. I'm engaging those clients. I'm triggering them in a sense. Just mentioning the idea of a psychedelic experience is sort of triggering, right? But I'm in control. I know what I'm doing when I'm saying that, because they're going, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I say, so yeah, right. You're telling me that I don't need that and I can have this powerful experience. And then I'd look at these kids and I say, I'm here to tell you. And I'd say, how many of you believe, you've only known me for a little bit, but how many of you believe I've done a little bit of acid in my day? And they'll go, and the acid heads in there. Oh yeah, you've done acid. We can tell you're that kind of guy. And I say, yeah, I've done a lot of acid in my day. And again, I'm baiting them. I'm engaging them. And I said, I'm here to tell you, I've had more powerful experiences in ceremony than in any acid trip I've ever had. And I just let it hang there for a second. And I'll say, I know some of you right now are wondering, trying to picture what that looks like. I've had more powerful experiences in ceremony than in any acid trip I've ever had. And I say, so you probably want me to tell you what that is, right? Yeah, like what is it? And you probably think, like I'm seeing, my name written in stars moving across the sky, or, some, mega hallucination. And then I'll say, I can't explain it to you because you don't know what it is, because you don't know what to compare it to. You can't explain it until you've known it. And right now, you guys only have one thing to compare it to, using mood altering substances, chemicals from outside of you to create the intoxicating hallucinations. That's the only thing you know how to compare it to. And I say, I will tell you, the extent of what I can say is most of the things that have been the most bizarre, powerful, incredible experiences I've had that are cooler than any acid trip, most of them have been totally normal looking circumstances. You wouldn't know that there was anything going on. It's the thunderbolt at just the coincidental time. It's the coyote walking out of the woods or howling just at that moment, or something like that. But I'll tell you, I've done this lots of times. When I'm explaining all that, these kids, these addicts that are just in the depths of their disease, they're just gotten into treatment, I've got them hooked and they're going, man, that sounds cool. That sounds cool. And I would be doing that to set them up to say, now, I can't guarantee you anything, but what we're getting ready to do, this is a workshop that I would do a couple days. And I'll say, what we're getting ready to do here, if you take this seriously and if your energy is right, there's a really good chance you can experience, what we might call, I also ask how many people would like to see magic stuff happen. And I get them to raise their, of course we'd like to see magic. I'll say, if you take this seriously, there's a good chance you can experience some magic. And then I say, but it doesn't work if the energy is bullshit in here. And that's me weeding out the negative attitudes. And I say, so if you really want this, it can work and you can have a really cool experience, but it doesn't work if you're going to make fun of this and blah, blah, blah. And I'll invite anybody who wants to make fun of this. You go ahead and leave right now. And then I go around and I have them make a commitment. Let's go around and talk about, I need you to be committed to this process. And these kids would all say, dude, let's do this. Let's have a good attitude. Let's take this seriously, because they want what I have just got done describing as possible. And that, again, to me, that's creating that spark, or that's hoping to, getting them to even set an intention to engage in an activity that might light the spark for a longer ongoing process, which again, I tie into their recovery as part of that process of coming to their true self.
Incredible. What an incredible work. And is that something that you still do, Jim, with youngsters?
I haven't, I ended up closing my office uh, during the pandemic. I had closed my treatment center 10 years earlier and went into private practice. And I actually sort of got away from it a bit because I wrote the book. I turned my attention to working with families, and I wrote Rehab Works. And I spent a lot of years working with families, and I would do workshops occasionally, but not near as much as what I had been doing. And now I'm sort of, a couple of years ago, I was having conflict. I felt pain about the fact that I had let that much go, that spiritual work. And a lot of people, that I was working with, doing support and treatment. And I work with families, don't even know that part of me. And so, but I've been doing all virtual work. And so the last year or two, I've been developing ways to resurrect this work, by delivering it through, it's not the same as working in person, but I'm teaching all this stuff. And in our move, again, we just moved from Texas to Connecticut, and I'm getting ready to, I'm meeting people in the professional community around here and sort of, want to get back out to doing that in person. But I've really been exploring virtual ways of delivering, like, meditation journeys. And I do a bunch of stuff with music. That's a whole other thing we haven't even talked about, is what I do with the music. But so
Tell us a little bit quickly about, in a nutshell, because I do want people out there to know also about the music aspect.
Well, the bottom line is, again, when I first got sober and I couldn't work in the field, what am I going to do? Well, I'm a musician. But I knew I couldn't go back into clubs, and that wasn't going to be a healthy thing for me at that point in my recovery. And so I thought, well, I'll do music and recovery stuff. And I ended up writing, I was learning about this spiritual journey, and I was learning about recovery really for the first time. And I was studying the medicine wheel, and I was studying the hero's journey and storytelling. And I was starting to, light bulbs were starting to go on as far as, addicts all have the same story. We hit bottom, we do what we need to do to pull ourselves back up. Oh, that's the hero's journey. Oh, that's the same thing as the medicine wheel. They're all cyclical processes that involve death and rebirth, right? And that's what I said at the beginning, that light coming out of the darkness. And I got this idea to write a rock musical that told the story of addiction. And because it follows that progress of the medicine wheel or the hero's journey, I wrote this musical, and I didn't even write it all. I took songs from earlier in my life, because my premise was, if we all have the same story, and me writing songs, anytime a person makes up a story, writes a song, writes a poem, it's a reflection of their experience in the world around them. And I thought, I've been writing songs since I was a teenager. I should go back and be able to find songs that tell my story. And so I put this program together that I call it The Journey, a musical story of transformation. And it's a musical journey around the medicine wheel. It's a musical portrayal of the hero's journey. And I developed a teaching curriculum around it. And I ended up turning that into part of my treatment program. So we'd be studying the songs that all teach about different aspects of the addiction recovery process. But then I would do stage productions with the kids in my treatment program. And I'd do School of Rock. I'd lead the band. The kids that could play music would be the band. And we had a theater component to it. And so we would put on productions. And so it literally became this event where every kid on the stage was acting out their own story. Every kid on the stage could have been the lead character in that, because it was everybody's story. And it even has, It has abstract references to the vision quest. It shows the dark night of the soul, kids sitting on their knees in the dark and talking to a voice up in the sky and having their moment of clarity and awareness of what they're doing in their life. And so that's this other thing. I still use the journey as a teaching tool for each one of the songs. That it has a ton of teaching, like I say, about all different aspects of the addiction recovery process.
Incredible. What an absolutely fantastic work. And really, I could ask so many more things because it's never ending. There's so many things I could ask. And for people out there, as we come to a close, Jim, who want to find out, because I know you have a YouTube channel, which is excellent, I have to say, because I've watched a few of the videos, and you have a website. But tell people out there, how can they find out more about your work?
Okay, my website is jimsavage.net. That's pretty simple. And my YouTube channel is Jim Savage Recovery. I do, what I do now is I do recovery coaching. I work with individuals. I have sort of what I call a recovery enrichment program that you can choose what you want to work on. Obviously I do a lot of this teaching in the spiritual or shamanic stuff, or the Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey stuff, or the creative stuff, using the music. And I have all these different modules. And so my coaching program is a 6-month program that can be used for it's, anybody who's, I use the term recovery, but it's whatever recovery means to you, right? So that I do that. I also do family coaching for, helping loved ones get into treatment and supporting families who are supporting a loved one in treatment. So those are the two things, jimsavage.net. That's all you need to know.
And you do one-to-one? Do you do remotely?
Yeah, everything's remote.
Everything's remote.
I have a ton of online coursework. I have an online course called Rehab Works. That's my family program, and it's a big online platform with a lot of curriculum. And then in my coaching program, all this, like I said, that journey musical program I have 400 pages of workbook stuff and hours of video stuff that I use in my coaching program. So they have access to all that stuff too.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on today. It's really been an eye-opener, and I have really learned so much. And there is so much more to learn. But thank you so much for coming on, Jim.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Mimi. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Do come again, because we want to know more about what you do and all the other practices. So when you have time, please do come again on the show.
Absolutely.
All right, then. Well, you look after yourself. Until next time.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Jim Savage. Extraordinary conversation. And it shows us that it's never too late to try again, to get the help that we need. And there's always somebody out there who can help. Grab the chance to change your life for the better. Don't wait. Thank you, as always, for joining me. It's always an absolute delight to share these moments with you. Go and do something wonderful. Go and do something for your dreams. Until next time, take care and lots of love.
Thank you for listening to Secrets for an Inspirational Life, brought to you by your host, Mimi Novic. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast, and see you in the next episode. For more information about Mimi Novic and her books, music, and inspirational work, take a look at her website, www.miminovic.co.uk.